my words that I'm going to say in introducing her. She has left out her master's degree.
Okay, go ahead.
In the list of the 3 degrees that she has. I'm Nancy Davenport. I'm the university librarian, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this edition of Books That Shaped America, which we are doing this year in co-sponsorship with the Humanities Lab. This is a series of books chosen by the Library of Congress several years ago, and they selected 88, allowing the public to recommend another 12 to add to the list. And the list was put together not because they were the best books ever written, not because they were the prize winners, but because they started conversations, or they changed the way we did things. If you think of Dr. Spock, or the kinds of books we read to our children, if you think of Good Night Moon and Snowy Night. They also talked about, we have another one of our professors in the room today who gave another book talk on A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And it was a lot about how we lived our lives. So the library's been happy to start these conversations, and particularly when community members come in, because it's one of the great benefits that we have of being able to talk about books in community. So let me finish this introduction. And thank you, Despina, for agreeing to do this as well as helping us shepherd this list through here. What she may have said before I walked into the room is that this book continues to be, or the movie made from it, continues to be the most popular movie of all time as measured in today's dollars. It's to some extent, watching that movie is almost a rite of passage, at least for girls, as we go through thinking about life and growing up as a young woman. And in some sort of weird way, for me personally, Scarlett's always represented a very strong woman. Clearly a woman who made her way in her time, but in her way, in the way that she made a life for herself and her family. To add to the rest of Despina's biography, she teaches interdisciplinary courses in literature and film, visual culture, and the history of technology and new media. Her interests include cultural studies, science fiction, apocalyptic narratives, not one of my favorites, but there are people who really love apocalyptic narratives, and the representation of race and gender in literature and film. And we've been having quite a conversation on this campus about race and gender this year, and the fact that we're able to talk about this through other media than our just personal experiences has really added quite richly to the conversation that's taking place on campus. She's published articles on robots and cyborgs, race and melodrama in action and disaster films, body transformation in technology and early film, the political role of the pinup during World War II, and the representation of the archive in postmodern fiction. Her latest book is entitled Anatomy of a Robot, Literature, Cinema, and the Cultural Work of Artificial People, published by Rutgers in 2014. Would you come to the podium and finish your conversation, start your conversation?
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. So I know that this series is about having kind of open-ended conversations, and so I didn't prepare a very formal lecture. I just prepared more of some thoughts about how I approach this novel and the event that it is in American culture today, and how I evaluate a little bit some of the ways in which it has shaped America. So I'm trying to go with the kind of logic and the title of the series about books that shaped America. But it is also the kind of topic that is almost impossible to bring out between the film and the novel, between the film and the novel and the cultural and historical legacies of both in relation to the past, in relation to the Civil War, and in relation to history of cinema. And so I will move between literature and film, and then hopefully at the end we'll have a conversation about how you have experienced both of them. So in a way, the book requires no introduction. This is the first cover, so I like to do the first edition. The book requires no introduction because it has been such a blockbuster event, both as a novel and also as a, come on in, as a film. It was incredibly successful when it first came out. It was immediately identified as a book that more than one producer wanted to create into a film. And it participates in a moment in American culture that is almost on the cusp of the old and the new. We have, in the 1930s, a great air of renovation, innovation, transformation, but also a lot of critical aspects of American culture. We are still in a very segregated world, and in a way, film as a cultural product transmits some of those challenges and some of those issues. So one of the things that is interesting to me about thinking about this book is to think about it as a novel of the 1930s. It has very little to do with the actual historical material of the Civil War and America in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. It's most, I would say, kind of poignant representation of what was going on in America at the time is about this kind of very tiny moment about immigration, about an Irish immigrant family, Scarlett's father, right? An Irish immigrant coming to the United States, settling in the South, and suddenly appropriating the moralities, the gestures, the lifestyles of the kind of landed aristocracy that we are used to imagining in the United States as unchanging and eternal. Right? So to imagine that actually what we're seeing with Scarlett O'Hara and her family is an immigration story is a very interesting transformation instead of what the novel does, which is it creates this ahistorical past in which plantations were always there. They were always static, they were always established, and also the way that that connects with the 1930s fantasy life in America, in which the past, that past, the Southern past, becomes a kind of an aristocratic fantasy life for an American environment that had been up to that point very proud never to have had aristocracies. So it's a very interesting thing that we see even today where we have Americans getting very much in love with things like Downton Abbey, right? Americans being very interested in the notion of princesses. It's a country that doesn't have an aristocracy, and yet it has a lot of aristocratic fantasies. And sometimes I think that we have to identify these fantasies as locating themselves in that representation of the South that both Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind actually produce. I'm interested in the ahistoricity of the novel, and also its complete appropriation, its fantasy appropriation of whatever details from the South are most appealing or most manipulable, in a way that, for example, the contemporary correlative would be something like Quentin Tarantino creating a fantasy, a revenge fantasy about the Holocaust in Inglourious Basterds. It's like the past suddenly becomes a playground that can give rise to contemporary fantasies of victory, or contemporary fantasies of comfort, or contemporary fantasies of if I had all the money in the world, that's how I would have lived. And so there's something so pernicious and difficult about how the book transforms the past into that fantasy and then is so powerful in that fantasy space that we can never necessarily recapture the past without it. And so right now it feels to me that a contemporary historical point of view, I would love to know what you think about it, has to swim through some of these fantasies in order to get at all to the past and to get to the complexity of the past, the tensions that are not at all resolvable through the story of the novel. I think that I have two slides that are very similar here, but so this is the same. So I'm interested in thinking about the book in two contexts. In one, the context of the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s that actually it supposedly represents. And as with film, film is even more pernicious and more difficult to shake off than a novel because the film gives us very real depictions of what life might have been like, what the colors would have been like, what the objects would have been like, what the clothes would have been like. And they allow, as a result, films allow an absolute projection into the past where you can almost feel like you know what it might have felt like to walk around there because you actually see real live people walking around in a setting that has been created as that mix of reality and fantasy. On the other hand, the book works really very well if you think about it as a novel and also as a film of the 1930s. It is a story about capitalism. It is a story about money. It's a story about surviving during very, very hard times. The things that we see Scarlett experience, the way that she always figures out how to land on her feet, the way that she figures out how to make money, how to survive, how to transform herself into a very radical, modernizing pace. Those are very good stories for the 1930s. And in fact, we do have a lot of stories from the 30s that are about producing that. Not producing the "and they lived happily ever after" spectacle, but producing the spectacle of absolute resilience. The fact that life will hit you with uncontrollable stuff, and what you have is the spunk, the chutzpah, the ability to survive, the ability to thrive, the ability to use the circumstances. And so in a way, Scarlett O'Hara is a very 20th century heroine heroine, and I would say a very 30s heroine, somebody who is very sure of herself, very modern, somehow not subject to any of the fantasies and requirements of her position in society in the South at the time. Right? In a way, Melanie is the depiction of a person who has absorbed that culture and that life and is acting out of those moral, social, and emotional values. And Scarlett seems somehow immune from those values. And she herself has a fantasy of the South in the way that she falls in love with Ashley, who is the classic old-fashioned Southern gentleman. So it is as if Scarlett becomes kind of a strange trans-historical figure who is a woman from the 30s positioned into the place where she could love the clothes and she could love Ashley, but otherwise behaves as a very modern person. The other thing that I wanted to interject here is the way in which the movie plays really well with the melodramatic structure of a lot of films that we know even today, and a lot of novels that we know even today, or that we see over time. A national story, or a transnational story, or a global story being given to us through the lens or with the addition of the point of view of a personal story. And that balance is very interesting in the book, which takes on, in the novel, which takes on this idea that it will do historical representation of the conditions of the South. A little bit differently in the movie, which allows us to see all of these amazing historical scenes, but it doesn't necessarily need to be accurate in the same way. And it also can transform them into much more modern debates and modern narrative structures. So it would be an interesting thing to think about what your attachment is to that book. If your attachment is towards the historical national story, if your attachment is through the personal story. I agree with Nancy that for a lot of women especially, Scarlett becomes such a powerful heroine that we start from the personal story, and then there are these long passages of battles and problems. You know, yeah, you know, there's all this stuff going on that just creates the challenges in which she has to act, right? The challenges that she has to face through time. So the idea of how the book participates in a constant reframing and a constant reinterpretation of slavery, of the Civil War, of the American past is, I think, a major question. In the United States, this is a question that has been posed many times, and it still continues to be posed now, very actively and with great urgency. But the book also is often given as a back-to-back with Birth of a Nation as a movie, a blockbuster film from 1915, which is itself based on a very recuperative story about the South as the location of an American authenticity that was violated by the War of Northern Aggression, Dixon's The Klansman. And so we have the positioning of slavery in this film and in this novel that we have to think about how we are connecting. Very recently, I don't know if you guys know, but there was a kind of a scandal in poetry circles when an American poet, Valerie Flame, decided to tweet Gone with the Wind over time, 140 characters at a time, and she basically tweeted the whole novel, or almost the whole novel, before there was an absolute outcry about whether that as an art project, her poetry art project, whether it was itself racist. The novel contains a lot of language that is incredibly hurtful, incredibly violent, and which we consider racist language and hateful language now. She did not edit these things out, but she was trying to present some idea of, in tweeting the book, 140 characters at a time, breaking in the middle of words, breaking in the middle of letters, right? You know, whatever 140 characters would do. For her, it was an interpretation of the novel. A lot of people did not find it an interpretation. They found it as a contemporary infection, again, of the contemporary public sphere by this language which we understand as being hurtful. There are some contaminating elements about the book. There are some elements in which you are seeing Margaret Mitchell trying to create an idea of what would it have been like to be comfortable in that setting, and in a way creating a very fictional position of comfort, which may or may not have been the position of people in that setting, right? But it does transmit some idea that I think is phantasmatic about the comforts and the beauties of the Old South, the kind of gallantry of the Old South, which comes straight out of things like Birth of a Nation and some of the Southern literature of the 1890s to 1910s. So in that aspect, it's a pretty old-fashioned book by the 30s. There is no reason to have this whole fantasy, whole cloth. So that's why I'm thinking about it as being both a book of the 30s and a book about the 30s in a way. The third element that I think is very important here is to think about the book and the movie and the fantasies they produce as fueled by the kind of Depression-era America circumstances. So for example, I wanted to show you at least a couple of images of what other fantasies of that area are, of comfort, glamour, the beautiful, amazing hand-beaded dresses that take 500 hours to bead by many of the Mexican-American embroidery workers that were imported from Mexico to be a guild to make these Hollywood spectacles of amazing clothes. How many carpenters it takes to create these kinds of sets. How many movies can hire hundreds of dancers and hundreds of extras. All of that is only possible when labor costs are very low. So all the fantasies that we see of casts of thousands, right, of 1,000 people working in the Gone with the Wind MGM backlot to create the spectacle of burning Atlanta. They are only possible, the spectacles of glamour and absolute comfort and absolute affluence are only possible when labor costs are so low. Does that make sense? It's actually only during the Depression that you can make this kind of fantasy of escape and of a kind of irrelevance from context. In Busby Berkeley musicals, the irrelevance from context is also because the sets are often so modernist and so unbelievable. You can see another set here, and they create a kind of an Art Deco mise-en-scène that is about exaggerated spaces that have exaggerated luxuries. But these aren't that different from what you see in Tara, right? You see exaggerated spaces that have exaggerated luxuries, that have this kind of textural representation of wealth. The velvets, the brocades, the crystals, the silver, the glowing chandeliers, right? And so that is, in a way, participating in something that runs throughout the 30s in American culture as a way to imagine fantasizing about spaces that have no time and no restrictions. And so the American South, the plantation, becomes another one of those spaces for me. So this is a critical way to think about what that fantasy does. It is a fantasy that is very, very powerful exactly at the time of stress or at the time of challenge. Just for some context, if the American film industry had a very, very major hit in the 30s, tickets cost 30 cents in 29 and only 20 cents in 1933. And as a result, the industry revenues fell amazingly. This is another reason why, adjusted for inflation, Gone with the Wind still has sold the most tickets, because it has made about $2 billion, I think, in contemporary money out of 30-cent tickets. People saw it more than once. People went to the theater, right? Does that make sense? It's enormous amounts of money. If you compare with contemporary movies, some of the films that make that kind of money are shown in 3D or in large formats that are much more expensive, so the ticket is $20 or $25, right, in comparison. And still, the movies were one of the major educational and entertainment formats for people at the time, and so more than 80 million Americans, 60 to 80 million Americans went to the movies every week. So it is still a major, major industry, even though it has this unbelievable crisis. A second thing that you need to know here is interesting in terms of the film's use of color. Gone with the Wind is one of the first films that uses Technicolor, and the transition to color film took a lot longer than it should have had, because a lot of the film industry had spent the late 20s transitioning into sound. And sound needed a lot more equipment. It needed retooling the theaters. It needed retooling the studios. It was a major investment of time and a lot of money. And then the crash happened, and the industry tanked. And so the transition into color became something that was a lot longer, that took a lot more time than it should have had, because actually for color film, you don't have to change the projectors in the movie theater. You can project a film in color as well as a film in black and white with the same equipment in the theater. So it didn't actually need that much equipment change as sound had. The film itself was a production by Selznick, who is an independent producer at the time. He is legendary both for being very dedicated to the art of film, but also for being very bossy and very opinionated and really very tough. And he also creates his own plantation fantasy of his own movie studio, exactly styled as if it is a plantation. And this image was in all of the Selznick films, even films that have nothing to do with the South. Right? That's the image of Culver City Studios. That's the kind of establishment that they want to create. So it's wonderful, right? Scarlett is this upstart, second-generation immigrant in the United States who basically both behaves as a Southern belle and also is clueless about what that requires emotionally, right? She is an entrepreneur much more than she is a Southern woman of her class and age. And Selznick is also an upstart who is basically kind of elbowing his way into the studio system. He doesn't have the money for the movies that he wants to produce, and so he kind of borrows both the stars and the studio lots. At the time, he's married to Louis Mayer's daughter, Irene, and so Mayer becomes somebody who funds MGM, fund the making of the film. Another way in which the film actually has this strange foot, both on the present and on the past, is in their presentation of the African American characters in it. In a way, it is both a retrogressive representation and also a sign of the changing things in Hollywood at the time. Hattie McDaniel famously said that when she was criticized for her performance of Mammy, which is paramount, right, as what solidifies this character for modern audiences, she said, "I'd rather play a maid for $700 a week than be a maid for $7 a week." And there are lots of folklore stories about the presence of this cast on the set and the way that people functioned together, the way that they worked together. There is a very famous story about Butterfly McQueen, who plays Prissy in the scene that's almost exactly after this moment, where she says, "I don't know anything about birthing babies," right? Scarlett considers that Prissy, of course, would know, because every black woman would know how to help with a baby's birth. Like, why would that be the case? And Butterfly McQueen famously, and again, this is kind of folklore, but famously said, in the set, Scarlett's supposed to strike her, supposed to slap her. And she says, "If she actually slaps me, I'm not showing you anything on screen. I'm not going to have any expression at all. If you want me to act as if it hurt, then she can't slap me." So it's a very interesting thing. Like, these are both actresses that suddenly have both a great visibility as, again, retrogressive characters, and also have a certain amount of agency in the film and enact that agency as professionals and as actors. Hello. There's lots of seats up here, too, if you want. Both of them were recognized by the Academy Awards that year. Hattie McDaniel won the award for supporting actor, and it was the first such award given to an African American, and for the longest time, the only one given to an African American woman. A couple of other things about the film that I'm using in understanding how the film makes a particular story out of the novel. So Selznick is the producer, MGM is the people who give half the funding, most of the sets and equipment in order to film, and also lend some of the stars like Clark Gable. The film changed 3 directors. George Cukor was the director that was most immediately assigned to the film. He spent more than 2 years in pre-production. So it is actually a pity that we don't have him as a credited director, because he did a lot of the preparation, including the sets, the costumes, the organizing the characters, a lot of the casting. So Cukor, who is actually a director very confident with women's pictures, who is great at doing melodramas, and who is a master of black and white cinematography. And so some of the films that you see, like Gaslight, is a film with Ingrid Bergman that is all about creating this interior landscape. Cukor filmed for about 3 weeks, I think, in the actual film, and he did most of the scenes that you see between Melanie and Scarlett. So that's why those films seem to have like a women's picture kind of balance, where they seem to be talking very honestly to each other. They seem to have a kind of an energy of friendship or an energy of connection, because actually he knows what he's doing with these scenes. There's a lot of folklore about why he was removed from the film, and Victor Fleming came in. All these people are on the payroll, right? All these people are people that are working in the studio system. They are there, and so the studio heads or the producers can switch them. As you see, both Cukor and Fleming worked for Wizard of Oz on the off times, right? Who was pulled out of Wizard of Oz and who was put into it. The Wizard of Oz is the other film from 1939 that has very interesting color design. So those are the 2 very big color pictures of that year. And then Sam Wood was somebody who only worked for about 2 weeks, I think, when Victor Fleming was so exhausted that he had a collapse. But it is like between those 2, between Fleming and Cukor, you do see Fleming doing the spectacular scenes, the scenes that are related to the war context, the scenes that are related to the burning of Atlanta, a lot of the grand spectacular scenes of the movie, and Cukor doing the intimate scenes in which people have to really debate their emotions, they have to debate friendship, they have to debate their values. So the element that I wanted to show you a little bit about in terms of the film is the element of color, because it is new at the time and because it does have some such interesting things for us to look at. And I will see if I can turn off the light so that you can see a little bit of what we're talking about here. I wish that I had a couple of slides of Wizard of Oz so that you can see how different the color is between the 2 films and how quickly, it's the same year, right? Wizard of Oz is also coming out in 1939, but how quickly color becomes something that is no longer a fantasy space, but needs to be able to be used for realistic representations of what color might look like in the new realism of color of the movies. I'm not saying how it would look like in reality, because it's film. It doesn't have anything to do with reality, but it tries to imagine that it does. What we have in Wizard of Oz is sometimes we have these very spectacular sets and where everything is glimmering or everything has stripes or everything has bizarre shapes. You don't see any of this here. You have a very centralized set of colors, very centralized palette that are working both with a color vocabulary and with a black and white vocabulary. So for example, in both of these scenes, you actually see that Scarlett is in the center of the frame, and she also is wearing the kind of color that isn't replicated anywhere else. Right? She's wearing white in both places. She's surrounded in these circular spaces by other people, and most of the highlight, the most intense light, is on her. That kind of framing would work both in black and white and in color. But if you didn't take care that, let's say, the men's suits would flow with each other in terms of color, you would have a cacophony of colors. And you see that in Wizard of Oz quite a lot. There is I think my favorite Wizard of Oz cacophony moment is when they get to Emerald City, and it is all green, but all different types of green, and it really doesn't work. It's overwhelming. It tires your eyes. It's very bad color design. Nobody says that about Wizard of Oz, but there are some elements of very bad color design. We don't have this here. Everything flows, right? There's a lot of gray so that your eye can rest. There's a lot of centralization of color. There's a lot of very warm tones in the light. Let me show you some more of that realistic tendency in color. They are not afraid to use a lot of pale colors because they're actually going for saturation. So for example, in black and white, this would not necessarily be a very easy frame to pull off. The person that would stand out the most in that frame would be Mammy, because a complete black outline in her dress is what draws the eye. So this is a lot of confidence to actually have something so pale and so gauzy with not that much kind of contrast between outfits and spaces, and to have that be so central in the frame. On the other hand, we see a black and white cinematography component here, where you do see the person with the black dress being so easily discernible, and so both Red and Scarlett really become so identifiable as the outlines of the two people who fit together, because they are the only two people. Actually, they're not the only ones, but they're the two main people wearing black in that much more colorful space. Again, the space does have some distractions, and this is two different qualities. I think that one of them is recolorized. I think it's this one. The space does have some distractions, so if you imagine her wearing a blue dress, it wouldn't work as well. It's only because she's wearing a pure black dress, and it is such a strict outline. The whole concept of the black dress also has some kind of interesting intertextual relationship to another film of the era, Jezebel. And I have just a couple of scenes to show you from that, because I think that you need to have it in mind in order to see how Q-core and the women's film and the melodramas of the 30s are working in relation to Gone with the Wind. In Jezebel, Bette Davis plays a Southern belle. Again, I think the movie is actually inspired by Gone with the Wind, but it did not, the novel, but it did not have the rights to implicate the novel in any way. And so it becomes a story of a Southern belle who's very spoiled. And she has a guy that she loves, played by Peter Fonda, but she torments him because she's so tempestuous and so entitled. And so she actually does play a Southern belle in the Southern belle kind of tradition. She decides when she goes to a ball that she does not want to wear a white dress like all the other women, but she wants to wear a red dress. Of course, in black and white, the dress appears black. And what emerges is a real gender division in which all the women are wearing white, all the men are wearing black, and by wearing something non-white, she has actually made a real gender transgression. Like she has actually, it's not just that the dress is red or that it's too off the shoulder or that it's a dress that was originally designed for a prostitute or a loose woman of the town. It's that she's also stepping into a kind of masculine privilege. And the film does this beautifully. All of the women are split up and create a white perimeter, and then the men behind them are in a black perimeter. It has like a nuclear explosion kind of effect, or a drop in the water kind of effect when you see the choreography. She, of course, tries to save the day by taunting all the men in the room, including her boyfriend. She says to him, "You basically are chicken. You're afraid that somebody will call you out." Or that you will have to call somebody out because they will insult me because I'm wearing this dress. So she plays a whole slew of the Southern, how to manipulate Southern men into doing what you want, basically, which is the same thing that happens with Scarlett, on the basis of honor and decency. And of course, these guys almost fight a duel over her. And as you see, she's very machinating there. And the kind of transposition of that. And then at the end, there's a lot of opportunities for her to atone, and she does. This is the subplot that we see with Scarlett and the red dress. Right? The dress is too scandalous for the time. In the movie and in the novel, these dresses are all about consumption. That's why I'm talking about the book as a book that is also related to capitalism. About consumption, about the conspicuous consumption of somebody who is having actually a very good financial situation at a time where the rest of the South is suffering. And so it changes the story of what that dress would have played as in the 1930s women's film into a story about money. But implicitly, and for audiences of the time, both of those storylines would have been together. This I wanted you to see because it's the kind of color analysis that somebody did of the film, of how intense, some of the intense films are in tiny, tiny little doses, and how it creates a kind of a pale and neutral, mostly neutral space for the faces and the skin tones of the actors to come through. Filming skin tone naturally was something that was a real challenge at the time, and it was really an issue. And it still is, and in fact, the fact of colored film also creates real difficulties about how people are not really well trained to light and to film people of different complexions, including people of African American heritage, whose skin sometimes looks very gray if it is not lit correctly on film. So then we have a lot of really interesting stuff about color. And then in addition to this realistic color, and black and white color, which tends to be highlighting contrast and highlighting color design, highlighting contrast. We also have another type of coloring in Gone with the Wind, which is kind of lurid. It's not my word. People have talked about it as a lurid type of color. You have these unbelievable sunsets, which is exactly the kind of show-off that people want to do when they film in color and when they want to film this kind of grand landscapes. And also you have a kind of expressionist color in which you actually see the characters more or less disconnected from their background in these frames that are purely about the expression of one emotion. You also have that towards the end of the film where Rhett Butler walks away in the mist. Right? And you actually, you lose him in the streets because the streets are so misty. So there are some ways in which the color plays all three roles. It is about expression, it is about realism, and it is about a type of cutout situation here where the characters are not in any realistic place at all, but they are essential. They are their own essential gestures or their own most ultimate personalities in this encounter. I don't want to talk much more about the film. I wanted to open this up for questions in relation to the movie, and actually I'm going to leave the one slide up that had all of my questions, which is this one, so that we can see how you guys feel about the film. So what do you think about the categories that I put together? When you read this book, do you read it as a book of the 30s? When I say this is a book of the 30s, does that make sense to you, or does it feel far-fetched?
I've always thought of it as a book of
Romance. Yeah. Okay, tell us more.
Sure, I can't remember so much of it.
Yeah, I mean, if you take that into consideration, then it plays into women's literature as a type of prototypical romance. But what is the history then doing? If it is a romance, it could be anywhere, right? It could be any time. So what is the history doing if we focus on the romantic aspect of the book? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's providing a certain kind of comfort, and it's for the South continuing a tradition that began right after the war to create the legend of the Great Lost Cause.
Yes.
The movie comes out in 1936. I think in 1935.
39. The movie is 39.
39.
Yeah, that's right.
The book comes out in 36. I think in 1935 there was a reunion of Union and Confederate veterans here in Washington, D.C. In fact, it's the opening scene of Ken Burns's multi-part documentary. And so here are men who fought in the Civil War, who lived in the time of Lincoln, and they're walking the streets of Washington in the time of Roosevelt and during the greatest depression, having fought in the greatest war in American history. More casualties than all American wars combined up until that point. And so it's at one and the same time a film that's about the 30s and the suffering of the 30s. It's about the creating of a legend that kept the South alive, and it's echoing a reality that's still going on. And these guys are still alive. It's not ancient history. It's something that was within the living memories of many people, including people who had been as children or infants enslaved.
Yeah.
And the movie doesn't make too much of that because, again, it's the 30s.
Yeah.
And the civil rights movement is a long way in the future. And so the emphasis is on the South, the reputation of the South. The South held a special place in American political life. Roosevelt couldn't have operated without the South and Southern loyalties. Southern loyalties are very, very important in the 1930s, the Democratic Party and to policy making generally. So there are so many layers here that are being played out.
But one of the things that I think is an interesting problem is, given the fact, as you're saying, that people are still alive who remember both slavery and the Civil War and Reconstruction and all the things that followed, then how does this novel come in and make such a fantasy out of it? You would think that there are people who could actually say, this is wrong, right? So you are seeing a kind of a willfulness to create the fantasy, right? The facts are there. There are lived experiences where people will say, I know exactly, my mama told me, and I know exactly this wasn't like this. And somehow that is not at all a point of view that challenges the fantasy of the novel. It fuels it.
As we do with all wars.
Yeah.
After the war is over, we create a series of fantasies about the war, of heroism, of bravery, and, you know, to an extent, some of the more recent films have reacted against that. Most particular, Saving Private Ryan. I mean, most people who've actually been in combat argue that the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan is the most realistic that's ever been done about combat.
Yeah.
But after every war, we do this.
Okay, the question for that would be, okay, why does American culture choose that particular perspective of the South to make into its romantic fantasy? Right? You could imagine that you could have a similar movie or novel that would be the valiant, the valiant soldier who wants to fight for liberty and the Union, and therefore goes and fights against the South. Right? And somehow we don't have that movie in the 30s. What we have is a new reinvention of the South as a space of an American historical image, an American historical authenticity, an American historical romance. And by making the Southern situation romantic, I think that we do have a certain legacy there that is very hard to shake for the rest of the century. The thing that none of us have access to, that then becomes a contamination into our hearts about what the South was like. Yeah, that's...
So what if the movie had never been made?
Yeah.
And there was just the book?
Yeah. That's a good question. What do you think would have happened?
I don't know. And I'm wondering about what visuals. I read the book before I ever saw the movie,
Yeah.
but I don't remember my visuals that I created in my head because they've been replaced by the ones that the movie has superimposed on them.
Yes, and instead what you have in the novel is you have a language that sometimes is very difficult to deal with because it's trying to do Southern accents and Southern dialects that are very old-fashioned and wrong and insulting and violent, and so that would have transmitted, again, a type of 30s idea of what the South might have been like, but almost unadulteratedly alienating. You don't actually have that, right? You know, Mami has a little bit of an accent, but she is not at all doing the kinds of long discursive formations that you see in the novel, and it's just about showing off her as a person who speaks differently in the book. You also don't have the transmission of all of this racial vocabulary that the book has. So there's something about film language actually modernizing the book. I think it feels a lot more antique to us now. You have all this vocabulary that, again, Margaret Mitchell is trying to reinvent as if it was a current vocabulary in the South, and that people now find very offensive. And it continues to be, like, it's as if it's carrying its little radioactive offense in a way that the film mitigates it by making things a little bit more understandable, a little more modern. Yeah?
I was going to say, I've not read the book, but hearing stuff like that, it makes me think a lot about, I know we were just talking in your critical approach class about the movies of the 30s and about the fact that a lot of their narratives are specifically about trying to overcome that sort of like the world will push you down sort of feeling. And I think that's definitely something that comes into play as far as like the modernization of the movie from its novel, because that really does make it one of, like, within the canon of 30s movie narratives. It really is like the takeaway for me for the Gone with the Wind movie was always that narrative, the narrative of overcoming the hardships that life throws at you,
Yeah.
economic stance even.
Yeah, that's right. I think that in that respect, it definitely fits very well in the 30s. About survival, about resilience, about, you know, you're not controlling the world, but you can control your own reaction. And we admire Scarlett precisely because she's so strong and because she manages to survive no matter what. A big change between the novel and the film is, of course, the fact that in the novel, Scarlett has 3 different children by 3 different men. And she kind of always somehow returns into the position of some of the eligible and manipulative bride to be. She seduces another person based on how she wants to move laterally in society. But the fact that in the movie they make her so virginal, right? That it is it's as if there has never been any consummated marriage up until she meets Red Butler and he carries her up the steps that one time. It is some way in which even some reviewers of the film in the 30s said, oh, too many marriages, they should have stayed with just the one love story between Scarlett and Red Butler. Like, it's like they wanted to make it even more streamlined, even less of an epic than it is. There are also things that are missing from the movie that were very powerful sentimental parts of the novel. I remember one of the scenes in which, in a kind of an absolute excess of plot, Melanie and a whole bunch of women and some widows of people who have fought in the Civil War are going and polishing and cleaning the gravestones of the Northern soldiers who have died in the South and are buried in the South. And the Southern women are doing the most decent thing that they could imagine. And the way it is described, you'd be like, oh, my, how did these people not win? They're so nice. It's just so impossible, you know? And then, of course, Melanie has a long speech about how she wishes. Actually, it's not a long speech because Melanie never has long speeches. But Melanie has a speech where she says she wishes that if her Ashley were to die in the North, that some Northern woman would have, right? So it does create a real sentimental idea about women's participation in the war, and then it puts a little bit under the rug the representation of the Klan as something that is going to restore a Southern manhood, the women who are secretly sewing robes and helping or pretending to be a sewing circle so that the men can go out. There's so much stuff there, especially for the 30s, which is a time where some of these things are suddenly becoming a lot more possible to speak out, and where suddenly lynching and the actions of the Klan are a lot reduced. Right? After 24, 25, we have a radical reduction of this kind of violence. And so this movie comes up to actually represent, again, to recreate the moment of a violence that is just beginning to ease up in terms of American culture. I have some statistics if you wanted to see that. But it's just fascinating me. I cannot get over how many of the elements of both of the novel and of the movie should not have worked. And then they do. They should not have worked as fantasies. For an American audience that is in crisis, what is this fantasy of a kind of eternal aristocracy? For a moment of absolute globalization, what is the fantasy of this reconnecting to the South as the place of American authenticity? Why is the South a place of authenticity? I think that it is, there's something really problematic, and I think that it is still radioactive in contemporary culture. We still have a lot of leftover elements of that. We see them in our political discourse, we see it in our movies.
But the same thing was going on in Germany.
Yeah.
Culturally, exactly the same thing in the 30s, a yearning for an earlier period of glory,
Mm-hmm.
of national wholeness and continuity. It doesn't surprise me because during the 30s, people escaped into the luxury.
Yeah.
You went into a theater, you could become part of a world that was so much materially better than what you were in,
Mm-hmm.
that it was like 2.5 hours of a vacation from your life.
Mm-hmm.
And you see Astaire movies that
Yes, of
do
course.
the same thing.
Yeah, yeah.
It's walking around in a top hat and tails. I mean, it makes a certain sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is why, for me, it feels like those two spectacles are connected. The escapism into the kind of Art Deco interiors and kind of modern going to the Ritz kind of life versus the escape into the South. But that's why I'm connecting them, because if one of them is an escape into luxury and into some kind of capitalist dream of pure consumption, the other one is too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can you speak about Margaret Mitchell and
and how that, whether she played a part in its popularity. Had she written other things? And did she have a particular historical background?
I don't think she had that much historical background. I think that she must have done some research, but I don't think that the book is very well researched in that respect. It feels to me that the book is actually a great kind of absorption and reinterpretation of other books and of elements from, let's say, Uncle Tom's Cabin, elements from other literary texts that would have happened. I think that her biggest invention, her best invention, is actually Scarlet. It is the invention of a character that is thoroughly modern. The book was very, very quickly very strong in terms of sales, and the movie blew it out of proportion in terms of its appeal. I don't think that it was required reading in the same way that Nancy was saying. It becomes a kind of a rite of passage in the 30s. You have to remember that that's also the era of people like Dorothy Parker and the kind of witty young woman who is so thoroughly modern that she would never be involved in the sentimental vocabulary. So again, we're looking at the great kind of dynamic mystery of popular culture, where the thoroughly modern woman has this kind of like the secret fantasy of the of some other kind of life, or of the much more old-fashioned gender roles, much more old-fashioned femininity, just enough modern aspects for that. I don't know that much about Margaret Mitchell myself. It's not something that I do in terms of my scholarship. Does anybody want to offer?
No, I was just curious if
Yeah.
she was a popular author to begin with.
No, I don't think so. And I think that this is her main book and her main kind of production. I don't think that she had that much success before or after. In a way, in her life, she becomes a very different modern example. She becomes a type of she becomes the type of the housewife who's writing at the coffee shop, and somehow it becomes a big success. Because I think that this is how people represented her for a little while. Somebody who just didn't have any pedigree as an author, any business being an author, and then here she is, and she has made such a big success. That in itself is a little bit apocryphal. I think it is a little bit problematic, because women authors that are very successful are always represented this way. Like, Harriet Beecher Stowe represented as the little woman who wrote the big book. And so I think that there's something about undermining the romance as a literary genre, undermining women's literature as literary production. Maybe I am undermining her too by saying she didn't do that much research. I shouldn't say that. But it isn't a book steeped into the historical. It's a lot more about creating the feeling and the emotion. She does do that, and she also has this kind of very pointy and kind of rollicking descriptive style, where everybody's being described so expressionistically. She describes the young men of the South as young animals, or that are like the best of the breed of the Southern gentleman, or something like that. There's a lot of really kind of salacious vocabulary there that I think was refreshing and also quite modern. She's not Stowe. Like, she does sentimental things, but it is not sentimental language. It is very 20th century language. Yeah.
She's also playing off the single most popular novel in the antebellum South, and that's Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. The South completely embraced that novel because it represented their own fantasies about who they were in terms of the Cotton Kingdom.
Yeah, yeah.
They were an American aristocracy.
Yeah, and all of these things are, still pernicious. They describe the South as an aristocracy instead of describing it as a type of capitalist economy. They describe the plantation as a patriarchal institution that's patronizing and giving, and everybody a member of the family, instead of describing it as a labor agreement that is actually, abusing the laborers. The southern plantation is a very interesting, and the plantation in general, like plantation agriculture, is a very capitalist enterprise. You import labor in order to create a specialized crop that then you export to other foreign markets. That's what happens with sugar. That's what happens with cotton. That's what happens in the West Indies. That's what happens in the Bahamas. That's what happens in Jamaica. That's what happens in the United States. So it is not at all the kind of like, oh, let's grow the vegetables we're all eating. It is nothing at all like that, right? It is, and especially in terms of Southern American plantations, one of the things that people have discovered in contemporary historical vocabulary and research is just how organized they were, how much of an engine the plantation was, with quotas for productivity. We see some scenes like that in 12 Years a Slave, which actually does do a lot of historical research, where some of the most experienced, let's say, field workers would row, would just, I don't know, harvest a row, and somebody would be timing it, maybe not a wristwatch, maybe somebody would be timing it, and then that becomes the quota target for the rest of the production of the day, where people's productivity is measured. And again, these are historical things that we don't see at all in Gone with the Wind, and we do see them in 12 Years a Slave, because we are actually in a much more historically demanding time, I think. But the idea that they would have a system, for example, plantations routinely had a system of bells and sounds that would signal times for breaks, or times for switching gears, or times for switching shifts and things like that. It is a factor, it just doesn't look it. And so we constantly mistake that era as an era of agrarian, aristocratic luxury, and by the 1860s, by the 1850s, Southern slave owners themselves start talking about how they feel so chained by and so enslaved by all of this adherence to productivity and money and capital, and for a small home where I could just indulge my love in agriculture. Like, they think that they are slaves to the timetable, that they have become too involved into the capitalist enterprise. You can also do the argument the other way around. You can say the idea of American slavery being something that benefits the South and creates aristocratic visions also hides the fact that so many people everywhere are benefiting from it, including northern institutions, including banks, shipping industries. Red Butler becomes one of those transitional figures in the book, because he actually does profit all around by fighting some kind of blockade. But you can also imagine him as being the only person who represents that other people are making money. You don't have any indictment of Bostonian banks that are making quite a lot of money out of the insurance policies for transporting goods and people across the ocean, that are participating in the import and export fees. When you're looking at something as central and as important to the United States as slavery, nobody's immune. And I think that on the one hand, you create this absolute fantasy of that's where it is, and you glorify it and beautify it in the movie. And on the other hand, you actually leave a lot of things out that should be coming in terms of creating accountability and restoring the historical circumstances. Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, so I'm always surprised that it seems like the Plantation Romance really does catch on as a genre for romance novels, but not so much for film. And I was wondering if there is a sort of reason for that, if it's just the scale of this film is something that can't be repeated, or if it's a more complex answer than that. I'm not sure.
So a plantation romance like Gone with the Wind,
Yeah.
like people in the South falling in love?
It seems like there aren't many films like this that come afterwards, and you would think with the immense success that might be something that studios would try to do.
Yeah, let me think a little bit. I think you have a lot of costume dramas. I think that very often, except for Jezebel, which comes just a year before, they're not necessarily in the South. There's a lot of costume dramas, and they place themselves in a little bit more, other environments or other countries. And so the idea of replicating the condition, if you think about it, that would be another way to think about Gone with the Wind. It is a novel or a movie that could be happening anywhere in France. Because you don't really show that many historical conditions that are purely American, and then it is transported into the American South. You had a comment?
Yeah, I was just thinking it's interesting to consider that question, because in a modern context, I would say that it could be because it's easier to get away with those kind of depictions in books because there's so many more books than there are movies. It's easier to have things slip under the radar in critical viewership than it is for film, I guess. But that really wasn't. I feel like it's not as much of a argument you can use for the time when Gone with the Wind came out. So it is actually an interesting question to consider. Why didn't they try to recreate the success of it, especially since it made so much money?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll have to think about it. There is another interesting tendency that happens later in reinterpreting the South in a very different way, which is something that you see in something like Anne Rice and Interview with a Vampire, which creates a kind of a Southern Gothic that includes slavery as a real institution and basically allegorizes slavery as a devouring institution and creating a vampire who is preying on everyone, including preying on slaves. So there are more recent reappropriations, but I don't know why the romance doesn't happen.
Showboat, to an extent.
Yeah, Showboat, but that's earlier. Yeah, and there's a remake that's in the 50s, but and then Showboat is also about passing in a way. Yeah.
I was born in that period when that book was written, and I hadn't read it. I had seen the movie when I was, 10 or 11 or something. But when I read it this last weekend, and I spent 20 hours sitting
Oh,
there,
valiant, you.
I got the sense that it was a feminist book.
Yeah.
That this was a woman who really was going against all the morals and all the customs and traditions of the society. And I didn't think that it was romantic at all. I thought her relationships, her first 2 marriages, were just of convenience.
Yeah.
And even the third one, throughout it, only at a certain point, near the end of the book, does it turn out that he loved her. And you really wonder about that, because everything that and that she loved him, although she wouldn't acknowledge that. So maybe I'm just looking at it from 2016 eyes, but I don't know if I had read that when I was much younger, and maybe I would have thought of it as a romance, but I didn't at all. She defied all romantic notions.
Yeah, I think that I agree with you. I think that the movie is much more romantic because the movie presents Red and Scarlet as people who are destined to be together because they're so alike. And in the book, it isn't necessarily so easy to see that, and it is not representing it that way. And it is representing her as somebody who is rolling with the punches and figuring out what she wants to do next and making her business. And Red Butler is some other presence that is not at all relevant to what she has to do. I think that by centralizing around their romance, I think that the movie makes it much more romantic and much more suspicious in that respect. But yeah, I agree with you. I think this is why so many people were very influenced by the book, and that why it has such a powerful presence as a book for women, because it is actually showing somebody who is unstoppable somehow, and that's why I'm calling her also a very modern heroine. I mean, I think she doesn't ever seem to have the limits that a woman of her upbringing might have had.
Yes.
Yeah.
But she did. It was amazing.
Yeah.
Driving around and going into, forests, going into places and a woman would never, of that class would never.
That's right, but this is why, I mean, I think that it works really well if you think of her as an immigrant. She's like, I don't know what y'all doing, but I'm in America and I don't care, my Irish grandmother isn't here to tell me no, so, right, so it works really well if you think about her as somebody who's not actually conforming at all. And so that's why then the movie has to figure out a different balance, how to sell her as a super conventional person that is selfish and petty and self-absorbed and narcissistic, and that's why she does all these things, which is not at all how she is in the novel. Yeah.
Well, Despina, I've come to see her in an entirely different way. Now, I'm not saying she's a sociopath, but I think she has sociopathic tendencies. And that's not something I would have said, as an early reader of Gone with the Wind. I was growing up not long after it, not too many years, not too many decades after it came out, and someone told me that Jackie Kennedy had read it 10 times or 12 times or something as a girl. So I was determined to read it. And I look at the way she acts now, in retrospect. I haven't read it since then, but, she marries 2 men who are intended for other women, and she doesn't care. And there are many other things she does that are just simply expedient, where she throws people aside and she uses them for her own ends. So she might be something of a feminist. I could see that interpretation, but I reflect on her now, and she seems really, it's pathological almost, that malicious.
Yeah, I think that is perhaps what makes her attractive to a lot of people, that she's behaving in she's not a good girl. Whatever you have been told to do is what Melanie does, and she's not going to ever do those things. She's going to do the opposite things. The character that is the most vilified in the novel is poor India, who is just, totally like, she always is thrown through to the wind of whatever has happened in the wake of Scarlett's actions. And so if you imagine it from the point of view of a young reader who is trying to find models for being, she provides a very powerful model that is also prohibited. Like, you don't do those things. You don't do those things to your best friend. You don't do those things to other people. And even in the movie, you can see that she doesn't even realize how good of a friend she is with Melanie. She thinks that Melanie is this goody two-shoes, who's just really silly. She doesn't even realize her own attachment to Melanie up until the very end when Melanie is dying. I think that for women's literature, the position of somebody who's going to be ruthless and active and kind of behave like a guy, instead of thinking, what am I doing, what are the repercussions, how do I negotiate or reconcile the demands of what I want with the demands of what I should want. And she doesn't actually try to reconcile that ever. She's like, this is what I want. And so in a way, it is as if she's not in a classic feminine position in the novel. She's in a position of pure action, instead of negotiation or I'll do this, but then I have to do that. Like, she doesn't do strategy, basically. She's just a force for pure action. So when people read it in a gendered way, they read her as petty, or they read her as narcissistic, or they read her as sociopathic. If you read it in a different way, I mean, I was reading her kind of also as an immigrant, which is funny. But if you read it in a different way, it is as if she embodies all the things that you do not know how to express if you are growing up within classic patriarchy. Because classic patriarchy tells you you should be a good girl, and this is what that girl does. And so that's why she's also very liberating, I think, for a lot of people. And that's why the novel, I think, it's very important that she doesn't just marry once. It's important to say, and this is part of the business for her. Like, this is how you progress in the world. In that respect, the book has some similarities with early novels like Daniel Defoe's Roxana, which is a woman who is exactly like Robinson Crusoe. So a woman who is early capitalist, going to survive no matter what, out of her wits and out of her body. And she is sometimes a courtesan, sometimes a wife, sometimes a prostitute, but she always makes money. And at the end of every relationship, she says, well, that was really good as long as it lasted. I got 5 pieces of cloth, 3 plates, 1 silver bowl, and she puts it in a bag and she goes to the next affair, right? And so it's a very picaresque book, which is very similar to Robinson Crusoe, except that he creates an agrarian kind of plantation economy, and she creates a kind of an entrepreneur who's kind of on the run. And part of it is that she also is selling herself. So you do see the kind of marriage and capitalism and marriage and success manipulation in the book, which I think is the non-romantic part. It's not like I'm going to hold on until the right guy comes along. It's the idea of manipulating the social conditions and responding to them in a way that makes you some kind of profit of them, allows you to survive in the book itself.
The Scarlet Woman of the 30s.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, people have talked about Scarlet as a name for her as well, and whether that has importance.
Scarlet A.
Yeah. How do you feel about her attachment to Ashley?
Fantasy.
Fantasy.
Well, and also his wife, I mean, her best friend, she was more intelligent than Scarlet was.
Yes. Yeah.
And more sensitive, and knew how to manage things in her own way, becoming the chairman of everything and being asked to do everything. And so she wasn't just sort of a sweet, lovely lady.
Yeah.
And I wondered about that close, why she could, they were so different. How could Scarlet have really loved her then?
Yeah, yeah, that's good. That's why I think it is important to think about them as both two versions of femininity, but also two versions that are given their own pretty much respectful possibilities there. I mean, I think that Melanie absorbs a lot of the sense of entitlement and class-related privilege of her circumstances, and she is admirable in delivering them well. So she does behave more as the model of a Southern lady and what she should be doing. The book doesn't indict her for that. The book doesn't make her into, and therefore you are the agent of this corrupt ideology. The book never actually puts one more step into that. It is as if she is enacting all the propriety and all the positive aspects of that ideological position without any of the negative ones.
I find that interesting because what TV is doing today is showing if the common denominator was one way, then they're throwing things at a person that would never have been accepted,
Mm-hmm.
long ago, and all the things they do, and you just think, wait a minute, how is that going to affect the newer generation?
Do you have an example in mind? Something you're thinking about?
It's just a generalization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys have seen, there's this great film adaptation of The Age of Innocence, where this, we are in the 1880s, I think, in the United States, very upper class. This man who is about to be married to this young woman suddenly falls in love for another woman who is divorced or somehow scandalous in some other way. And somehow you see there the operations of a type of ideological position where the whole social context conspires very fluidly and very easily to separate them without anybody knowing what happened. It's like they invite them both to the party. There's never a notice that something is being machinated, that something is being manipulated. But somehow it becomes completely impossible for them to see each other because the social context works so perfectly as a context for we know what's proper, and of course this is not going to happen. And this man thinks that he's acting out of his own desires, but it is impossible for him to be together with this other woman because it is just not done. That's the thing that we don't see in either the novel or the movie. We do not see the operations of a system that would have these kinds of moves. We see a lot of individuals acting. We see Melanie as an individual. We see the men as individuals. We do not see the way in which a social context conspires or a social context manipulates conditions. And so there's something there that I think that's one of the things that is the kind of individualistic reading of the agent and action and self in the 30s, rather than what, let's say, an Edith Wharton would have done with how class works. I think that Mitchell has a fantasies of class, but she's not describing class-based action where a whole bunch of people would know exactly how to do this, because that's how you preserve social circumstances and social conditions.
But that's shattered by the war. I read in my class a letter written by a reporter who came across young ladies who were working in stores behind counters. Mm-hmm. And I love the last line of the piece. It says something, and they hold jobs without loss of caste.
Mm-hmm. That's right, yeah.
Because it was an economic necessity.
Yeah. And in that case, the loss of caste would have been something like marrying a profiteer, like what Scarlett is doing. You're wearing a red dress where nobody else has any money. Yeah.
Or Rose Riveter not wanting to go home again.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I mean,
that's right.
women stayed in the workforce after World War II.
Yeah.
So I wonder how, I've never thought about this as a book of the 1930s. Mm-hmm. I thought about it as a book that was written in the 1930s, but about a much earlier period. I thought about it because I read it as a novel.
Yeah.
So I'm intrigued to take that. Have you read anything by Diane Gabaldon? The Outlander series?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
But very long, yeah, very little.
But so it's written in the last 10 years, and it's the story of a woman who is married to a British World War II veteran. He is convalescing after the war. they're in Scotland, she goes for a walk, and she ends up 200 years earlier. And the time travel continues. She and her daughter can time travel back and forth and all this.
Yeah.
So it's the why. I mean, if this book written in the 30s was to help us learn something about the 1850s, why is this book being written?
In women's romances and women's literature, sometimes the time travel to another time facilitates a kind of a more critical understanding of patriarchy that is not possible to do in the present. So in the present, we have this idea that we are emancipated, we have this idea that we are powerful, we have this idea that we are acting out of personal agency, and it's very difficult to then put into words where patriarchy is and what it does to us. Get transported 500 years ago, and you would know where patriarchy is, because it would be, these guys are brutes, my mother is selling me to the highest bidder, I'm not allowed to marry, I'm not allowed to have a job, I'm not allowed to smoke, I'm not allowed to to learn how to read, and you're like, there it is, this is patriarchal oppression. And so sometimes there are these kind of fantasies of an almost sadomasochistic nature in women's literature that are not about wanting to be submitted to these conditions, but it's about kind of restaging the troubles of patriarchy in a place where they become a lot more visible. They become a lot more identifiable, and then in contrast, the present is more difficult to gauge. You can see that also in romantic movies that are related or that are addressed to women. Sometimes it's very hard to say, you are a contemporary businesswoman, you are a contemporary, you have your own income, you earn things, you can own your own house, nothing is missing. So there is no vocabulary to describe what you might actually still crave or want, or what you think has already been thwarted by the conditions of our lives. And if you move it to 500 years ago or 200 years ago or whatever, those become very easy to see. The problem is that it creates a recuperative narrative where we've come so long, it's always victorious about the present is always better, because we can have jobs, we can smoke, we can go out, whatever. And we can have an education. So the present is always much better, and the past becomes a place for then experiencing the present in its positivity rather than the present in its negativity, like the things that are missing, the things that bug me.
So which she shows by knowing modern medicine.
That's right.
Of the 50s and how to make penicillin. Okay.
And the medicine is also a very safe way for a woman to have a job in any era. Right? It allows a contemporary audience to identify a position in the past that's possible. A similar thing happens in different types of movies with prostitution. Like there would be a woman who would have cultural access because she would be able to go to these important salons, and she would be able to go to the world of men. There is a counterpoint in that she has to actually be sexually available to men, but it is a much more agency-full position than the girl who has to be at the convent until 19 and then she has to be married off to someone, which is impossible for contemporary women to understand as an agency position. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Oh,
Bye.
I was going to ask you about Ashley Wilkes, since you brought him up. He's different from all the other men around. So is Rhett, but Ashley particularly. I think he's Northern educated. He knows immediately that it's a lost cause on the day of the opening barbecue. All the other young men are whooping and hollering and gung-ho to go out and beat the Yankees in a day. And he knows that it's not going to turn out well.
Yeah.
And seems to have insight into Scarlett too, that she doesn't have into herself.
Yeah, I think that they make him into a very romantic hero because of that, right? He's not just the person who is deluded into the ideological position of compliance, where it's like, yeah, South is great, we're going to win. He is the person who knows they're not going to win and therefore only fights for the principle. So it's extremely romantic. It's extremely romanticized. It's like, it's the man who is afraid who goes to war. That's bravery. The man who doesn't know anything, or the man who's high, who doesn't know they're being shot at, that isn't bravery, that is just cluelessness. So I think that they represent him as a very complex character because of that. Also, it has this kind of melancholy aura that I think is very attractive in romance vocabularies in general, very emo. If you wanted to put it in that
And I guess Rhett knows the outcome too, but he's much more sardonic and cynical in his presentation.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Join me in thanking Despina.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
And if you would like to come back to the next in our series, which will be completely different, it is a snowy day, which will be on April the 5th. And this will be led by one of our education librarians who also teaches in the School of Education, because it's a children's book. And so parents